So what is the psychology behind men like James Craig, Alec Murdoch, Brian Walsh, Chris Watts, or Scott Peterson? Men who marry, start families with their wives, remain together for a decade or two in many cases, and then boom, they murder their wives and sometimes their own children. Is there a common thread between these cases? I believe there is. Just a reminder, I am not diagnosing anyone in this video, it is merely my speculative analysis from the facts that we know. Some of you out there have heard the saying, men are like waffles, women are like spaghetti. The male brain typically compartmentalizes things into little separate boxes. There's a wife box and a work box and sometimes a mistress box and even a nothing box. So when a woman asks a man, what are you thinking about? And he says nothing, he's typically telling the truth. Women in this simile are like spaghetti in that everything in their minds touch, it's all connected. Compartmentalization is a key component in most murder cases, along with objectification and extreme fantasy. Wife was likely viewed as object. Initially, of course, an object for pleasure and validation, like a new car or a house. But she eventually morphed into a troublesome object, in the way of a fantasy life, and she needed to be removed. What's most disturbing about these cases is that most of these men seem like your average American husband, and many people who are currently married look at their spouses and ask, can I be married to someone like that? Could my spouse do this? How were these wives convinced for so long in these marriages that they were loved? In order to answer a question like this, we have to examine the dark side of empathy. People tend to use blanket terms such as narcissism or empathy to explain psychological phenomena. We assume that terms like self-involvement or egotistical automatically imply something negative, and that having empathy automatically implies something positive. It's often said that those who harm others, either physically or mentally, lack the ability to empathize. Many do not realize that empathic ability is value neutral, meaning it can be helpful or hurtful depending on how it's used. Empathy in and of itself simply means the transmission of emotional information. Empathy is therefore not synonymous with compassion. Sure, we must have empathy to feel compassion, but having empathy does not automatically mean you're compassionate. Manipulation requires the ability to read people and to understand people at an emotional level. In other words, it requires the ability to empathize. Some break empathy down into two components. There's cognitive empathy, which is the ability to read people and cognitively understand someone's emotions. And then there's emotional or affective empathy, which is the ability to share the experience of emotions. These two types of empathy can be split apart or compartmentalized. Someone may be able to understand how a person is emotionally feeling, but not be emotionally affected by that state. They can sense that the other is sad, but the sadness on an emotional level doesn't reach them. Many cutthroat CEOs, for example, have arguably higher levels of cognitive empathy than your average Joe, which helps them get ahead. And this brings us to the two additional components of empathy. There is compassionate empathy, which is the ability to understand the emotions of others and then use it to help the person because you care. And then there's instrumental empathy or antisocial empathy, which is the ability to understand the emotions of others and then use it for personal gain. Manipulation for selfish means is the yin to empathy's compassionate yang. Instrumental empathy is common in people who have antisocial personality disorder, a diagnosis that all of these killer husbands most likely have, coupled with a few variables of narcissism. Instrumental empathy is also common in people who are merely selfish or egocentric. These individuals may understand and even mirror the facial expressions or feelings back to their partners, but they don't feel them. Studies show the ability to tune into the emotions of others using mirror neurons are present even in people who are considered psychopathic or convicted criminals. People use instrumental empathy to exploit, to manipulate, to deceive, and to use the other person in order to satisfy their own needs. But most people who use empathy to manipulate do not go on to murder. Some refer to these killers as wolves in sheep's clothing. A wolf in sheep's clothing implies a wolf mirroring the characteristics of a sheep. In order to understand what all of these husbands had in common, we also have to understand what all of these wives had in common. The victims of these stories wanted the happily ever after and the Prince Charming. Superficial charm is a flag, by the way. And they fell for the storybook version of things. How important was it for the wives in these marriages to not only convince themselves, but also the world that they had a successful married life? As we now know, the lives these wives projected to the public was far from picture perfect in reality. But they held up appearances. They kept the facade. Arguably, both people in this dynamic lived in the fantasy of appearances. And at some point, things went from the fantasy of their lives to the reality. Was it your wife getting pregnant or focusing her attention away from you and onto the kids? Was it that a mistress made you fall in love with a shiny new validated version of yourself in her eyes? Is it that facing your wife eventually became a constant reminder of your fraudulence, and she made you confront it in some way, and you needed to squash that out of existence? American culture has specifically conditioned men to get ahead and win at all costs, letting nothing stand in their way of achieving success, and yet they get slammed for being self-centered or narcissistic. American culture has conditioned women specifically to achieve and maintain the happily ever after at all costs, and yet they get shamed for being nothing more than mothers or housewives. Projection and denial are incredibly powerful tools that people use when they're in relationships. We project onto other people the versions of ourselves that we want to believe exist in the other person, and we deny any evidence that doesn't fall in line with that fantasy. So when Angela Craig was first drugged by James in 2017 and he gave her the excuse that he didn't want her to get in the way of his suicide, her choosing to stay with him after such a terrifying incident would imply that there may have been some kind of denial involved. Denial regarding who her husband actually was. And this denial may have cost her her life. So how does one identify and protect oneself against these types? Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to make a video on that.